Welcome to episode 4 of the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about spine flexibility and understanding what is a flexible spine, why it's important. In this episode, we're going to explore sort of 5 bullet points, 5 topics. It's going to be, first of all, the anatomy of the spine and its functions, because I do believe that when we come to a better understanding of the anatomy of the body, it essentially tells us the story of how it wants to work, and then we just have to sort of follow along accordingly with our everyday movement and our exercise. We'll look at adequate spinal flexibility, we'll look at what it is, why it's important, the relationship between spine mobility and low back pain, because there are some misconceptions, and that's sort of the next point about dispelling these misconceptions and myths about spinal flexibility or spinal stiffness and spinal flexibility, and then recognizing any signs and symptoms of a stiff spine or an unstable spine. So part number 1, the anatomy of the spine and its function. So what we're going to do is we're going to go sort of down to the sort of the deeper anatomy, and then we'll basically build our way out. But if we go in some respects to what the spine is, essentially we're talking about vertebra and discs. We're mostly going to be talking about the lumbar spine, and then we're essentially going to be building out from there. We will talk about elements of the thoracic spine as well, because that's important to understand when it comes to the lumbar spine. But essentially what we're talking about are, we've got vertebra, and then we've got a disc, and then a vertebra on top. In the lumbar spine, it sits on the sacrum. So you've got S1 at the top of the sacrum, you've then got a disc, and then you've got L5, a disc, L4, a disc, L3, 2, and 1. And then you go into T12, a disc, T11, but essentially where T12 is where the ribs begin. So we've got the lumbar spine, which is essentially vertebra and discs stacked on top of each other, or 5 vertebrae and 5 discs that are stacked on top of each other. Then we have ligaments on the back of it and on the side of, on the back and the front side of it, which is the ligament on the anterior side and the ligament on the posterior side. Then as we build out a little bit further, we've got the tendons and the muscles, and then as we build out a little bit further, and in some respects within all of that, deeper and superficial, you've got fascia that wraps around the spine through it, and so on and so forth. So in some respects, that's the basic anatomy of the spine. When we talk about a vertebra, we've got the spinous processes on the back, or on the back of the side, because you've got the spinous processes along the back, and then you've got the transverse ones that sort of poke out to the side. So when you bend forward and you've got that knobbly bit going down your spine, those are your spinous processes. With regards to the disc, what we've got is, if you were to take the vertebra off the top of the disc and look down as a bird's eye view of it, you would have a gel-like fluid in the middle, and then then you've got like fibrous rings, like rings on a tree, that sort of wrap around that. So basically they are holding the gel inside. So we've got the disc with the fluid inside, and then you've got this fibrous wall that wraps around it, and there are many different number of rings that go to the outside. You then have different shapes to that, which in some respects give it a slightly different, or a slightly different sort of genetic function of what it can cope with and manage. But when we then come to the muscles, what we've got the deep muscles, which are the ones that go between the spinous processes. So from, say, L5 transverse process to L4 transverse process on both sides, and then you've got a muscle that goes between spinous process of L5, spinous process of L4, and then that happens all the way up in each segment. And then you've got some that go diagonal from spinous process to transverse process. Now these muscles are, they're essentially proprioceptive posture type muscles, because they've got a lot of nerve endings that are there to understand position of the spine and where the spine is essentially in space. So is it stacked on top of each other? Is it slightly twisted? Is it flexed? Those muscles respond to that and feed back to the brain the position of the spine. So that'd be flexion, extension, lateral flexion, rotation, whatever it may be. So we've got those muscles. Those are the sort of the deepest lying muscles. Then you've got the sort of the mid-lying muscles, if you will, and you've got transverse abdominis, that will join into the spine. You've got the QL, quadratus lumborum, which comes out of L5, L4, L3, L2, L1, goes across the top, it goes across the bottom rib and goes across the top of the pelvis. So if you've got the spine in the middle, you've kind of then got these muscles either side of it, essentially joining the pelvis, the spine, and the ribs. Then you've got the erector spinae group. Mainly for this area, you've got longissimus, which is slightly closer into the spine, and then you've got iliocostalis, which is slightly wider, and they both sort of go up in sections. They're known as the erector spinae group, and they go up in sections all the way up the spine. And then sort of getting close to the spine, you've got multifidus as well, which is one, you sort of could call it a deeper lying because it is sort of segment by segment, but it is one muscle going all the way up the spine. So they are the, let's just say, like the deeper lying or mid-lying muscles. You could also include internal obliques into that because they are on the inside of the external obliques. So you would then call sort of external obliques the sort of the more superficial muscle. You could also have iliocostalis and longissimus in that group as well. But what sits over that is the thoracolumbar fascia. So more superficial muscles would then join into that. Latissimus dorsi comes down from right and left armpit. So the thoracolumbar fascia is one unit that is essentially the abdominals, or where the abdominals is. But essentially with the thoracolumbar fascia, we're talking about one section of it, which is where, so if you can imagine like a diamond shape, you've got latissimus dorsi from the right that comes down from the armpit down into one side, latissimus dorsi from the left come down from the armpit into one side. Then you've got the glutes or glute max, which then joins into it as well from sort of bottom left and bottom right. Now, when these muscles are contracted, so latissimus dorsi and glutes, that essentially is pulling taut the thoracolumbar fascia, which is giving you additional stability. So when we talk about stabilizing the spine, we're not talking about transverse abdominis, we're not talking about multifidus, we're not talking about QL, we're not talking about the erector spinae group, we're not talking about lats or glutes, we're talking about all of them. So we have to be able, with regards to function and stabilizing the spine, we have to be able to talk about all of them as one unit, because with regards to the thoracolumbar fascia, it's essentially the same fascia. Because if you look at any diagram sort of from a bird's eye view through the abdominals, you will see that the fascia is essentially sort of 3 layers of fascia, but it's still the same thing. But what we've done is we've called the thoracolumbar fascia the most superficial part of that, one part, then you've got the abdominal fascia, which is another part, but essentially it's the same thing. And then the muscles just fit within this. So that's, in some respects, building out the anatomy, and we've started to talk about the function with regards to the thoracolumbar fascia. If we then just talk about the function of the spine, the function of the spine, or in some respects, the function of the muscles of the spine, I should say, is more so to hold the spine in place, particularly in the lumbar spine. Because when we talk about the lumbar spine, we've got the pelvis at the bottom, then we've got 5 vertebrae, and then we've got the thoracic. So we've got the 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then we've got the 12 thoracic vertebrae, and you've got the rib cage. But there's nothing either side of it apart from the muscles. So when we're talking about flexibility of the spine, this is going to become important soon when we talk about the next point. It's going to be important to understand what's stabilizing it, because there are no bony structures there. For the thoracic spine, it gets a lot of stability from the rib cage because of its bony structure. The lumbar spine doesn't have that, so it needs its stability to come from the muscles. The QL, internal, external obliques, transverse abdominis, latissimus dorsi, glutes, so on and so forth. Erector spinae group to be another one. So the function of those muscles is to hold the spine and stabilize it. So like guy wires on a tent, if you've ever put up a tent, you put up the main shell of the tent with the poles, and then you have the guy wires that come off that basically stabilize it and fix it. That's what these muscles are doing. You've got the basic structure of the vertebra, the discs, and the ligaments, and in some respects, the deep-lying muscles, because they aren't really anything to do with stability, they're more to do with the position of it. So we've got that. And then we've got all of those muscles, which are the guy wires for it, holding it in place. So that's what the function of all those muscles are for. If we then expand out and go to the thoracolumbar fascia, one of its functions is when the lats and the glutes are engaged, is to pull that taut. And then that adds an extra layer of stability. And because it attaches to each of the spinous processes and the vertebra, it literally holds that up. Because when we go into flexion, we create what's called an anterior shear, which is essentially the vertebra wants to fall off the front. So that sort of movement where it wants to slide forward is known as an anterior shear. What the thoracolumbar fascia does is neutralizes that and holds it back. So where the vertebra wants to fall off the front, not that it will, but the force is essentially encouraging it to do that. What we then want is that thoracolumbar fascia to pull it back, neutralize it, and hold and stabilize the spine in place. So that is a very sort of basic understanding of the anatomy of the spine or the lumbar spine and its function or the function of its muscles. So what we'll start to do now is talk about flexibility, because when it comes to back pain, people think they need a flexible spine. Having a flexible spine is a useful thing to have, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we have to understand is if we've got spinal flexibility, what we need as well is control. Because if you've got a lot of spine flexibility, it can become unstable if it's not controlled adequately or controlled properly. So what we need is adequate spine flexibility and control. So if you have more spine flexibility, you need more control to go with that. Because as I mentioned, if you've got lots of flexibility but little control, then you're going to have a lot of instability in the system, and then instability is going to lead to greater chances or risks of back problems. So what we need to be able to do is control that flexibility. Now, if you have a stiff spine, it could be that the body is already recognizing instability, and it's unconsciously just pulling everything stiff to gain a degree of control over the spine. And then when you try and make it flexible, unconsciously the body goes, I'm not having this, I want it stiff. So it just creates it stiff again. And the stiffness within that is increasing the instances of aches and pains and problems in the spine. So it's not the stiffness is the problem, it's the instability that's the problem that's causing the stiffness. So as we start to unstiffen the spine, we need to encourage control to the spine to stabilize it. So what you're basically doing is you're taking conscious control of your spine rather than an unconscious control that your body's doing, and its default system is just to lock everything tight. So what we need to be able to do is when we create spinal flexibility, we need to also create spinal control. And this is a lot of what I talk about with regards to lower back pain and maintaining that neutral posture, certainly under load. When it's not under load, if you watched my Should I Bend My Spine episode, then what I talked about there was you can bend your spine if it depends on the load and the power going through the spine. Because if you've got lots of movement and power going through the spine, it's going to be disadvantageous or unadvantageous, whatever the right word is, for the spine. But if you've got movement going through the spine that's controlled well, that's a low load, then like a golf swing, for example, then that's going to be more advantageous when it comes to sort of minimizing risk of lower back pain and things like that. So there are caveats and nuances to the information. So why adequate spinal flexibility and control matters is that that's what creates the stability. So again, what we need to be able to do is create stability or control whilst creating flexibility in the spine, which is basically all comes down to controlling the muscles and then controlling the movements of that we do of the spine and controlling the muscles. So next, as I've sort of described, the relationship between spinal mobility and lower back pain. So when we've got additional mobility in the system, we've got instability in the system potentially as well. So what we have to be able to do is keep that mobility controlled, because as I've mentioned, that can lead to lower back pain problems. Now, with regards to sort of lower back pain, it would be things like back spasms could become a problem, which are like the catches that when you go to pick a pen up off the floor, all of a sudden, just randomly, your back just locks up because it's recognised there's an instability in the system. It could be that there is a disc pathology, so there is problems with the disc. It could be that, but it could just be there's some laxity in the disc, and then that's creating the instability in the system, which is then leading on to the back spasm. So by creating more mobility in a spine like that isn't going to be necessarily that advantageous. If you've had problems of, or if you've had disc problems in the past, again, that can create laxity. So it just micro movements. It can create, obviously you've got then disc herniations, disc bulges, which can then sort of tap onto nerves and create back spasms as well. So it's understanding what's going on within your spine to then be able to manage and know how to manage what you're doing. So it's very much talking about creating, well, first of all, knowing the problem and then creating that control. Additional mobility can create laxity in the ligaments, which can then add to the anterior or lateral shears of the spine, which can then lead on to laxity in the disc or degenerate discs a little bit faster, which again then can lead to lower back problems. So it's, I mean, there's a lot of ways that this can go. I've given a sort of a few examples of that, but very much what we need to be talking about is controlling the mobility and the flexibility of the spine. So, as I mentioned at the start, with regards to dispelling some myths of spinal flexibility, the biggest myth is that spinal flexibility is just a blanket good thing. It is a useful thing to have, but it's not essential. A lot of it will depend on what your activity is. If you're a golf player, there is use of having flexibility within the spine, but again, that needs to be controlled, and most of the flexibility needs to come from the hips and the shoulders anyway, because the spine, you need to be able to transfer the power from the hips, from the shoulders, through the spine, rather than getting the movement from the spine. Because as I mentioned in the anatomy part of this, was when it comes to the function of the spine, it's about the muscles of the spine, it's about preventing movement, not about creating it. Because if you look at a golf swing under sort of like an EMG machine, what you tend to see are pulses of muscle activity. So as the spine is rotated and you get back, and essentially you go from the back swing into the forward swing, as it were, you get a pulse of muscle activity. As you then go through the swing, the muscles start to relax. As you then hit the ball, the muscles pulse again. And then the same happens at the top of the swing and as you come back out of it. So there's always this pulsing of the muscles that go throughout the spine, or go throughout the movement onto the spine. So what we need to be able to do is have that understanding. So first of all, we need to understand what we're using it for. If you're not like a golfer, but you're working in a warehouse where you're lifting a lot of heavy boxes, you may not need as much flexibility in the spine. But what you do need is the ability to stiffen the spine with muscular control, so you don't then lose the posture of the spine whilst you're going through the lifts. So you can start to see there is there is sort of one end of the scale and another end of the scale to this. And what we're trying to do is, number one, sort of understand what end of the scale we're on. So then if we're on the golfer's end of the scale where we need more degree of flexibility in the spine, how do we train that control? Or if we are on the other end of the scale, a warehouse worker that doesn't require huge amounts of flexibility at the spine, they will require some. They don't need literally like an iron rod in their back, so they can't move their spine. But what they do need is they need adequate flexibility of it, so it doesn't create pressure within the spine, so it can't move, or because it can't move. But what they need is when they are going through their everyday tasks of lifting and carrying and moving these heavy boxes or loads around the warehouse, they need to be able to stiffen their spine adequately to be able to complete their job properly without aggravating the spine. So they need a degree of flexibility just for regular health of the spine, but they don't need excessive amounts because they don't need that for the golf swing or whatever it may be that they think they need spinal flexibility for. So it's understanding these sort of two ends of the spectrum, understanding where we sit within this spectrum, and then training the body to be able to have what we need it to have. So if we need to have the control, we need to go through that process of building that control. If we need the stiffness, we then need to be able to understand how to create that stiffness and understand how we go about, first of all, creating it and then using it. And then finally, we're talking about recognizing signs and symptoms of a stiff or unstable spine. Well, essentially, if we're getting painful catches, that could be a sign. Now, that's not to say it is, because you need to go through some degree of assessment for that. And once we can understand what the driving symptom is, we can then go about addressing it. But with that said, if we have signs of painful catches, it could be that there's laxity in the disc. It could be that there's some disc degeneration. It could be that there is disc bulging or disc herniation going on, which is going to create problems within the system. So having a hypermobile spine with that is going to create potential problems. If we've got excessive stiffness through the spine, it could be that you've just got excessive muscular tension around the spine. It could be that the spine isn't going through its range of movement. So it's being able to try and recognize that, and by going through the online assessment that I'm providing, or that I'm able to provide, where we look at we look at the spine, we look at the hips, we look at the muscles of the spine, and we look at the core. So we look at all these different areas to see where the problem is coming from. Is it instability? Is it stiffness? Is it hypermobile? Is there certain postures of the spine that is a problem over other sort of postures of the spine, if you will? So it's coming to all these types of understandings. Once we've got to those understandings, what we can then start to do is look at the exercises that need to be able to control that. And what we would essentially start with regards to both of them, because if we need to create control, what we need to be able to do is, again, if you go right back to episode 1 where I said start with simple exercises, that's where we need to start with both types of population. Both types that need flexibility and both types that have flexibility but need to create stiffness. So what we need to be able to do first is start with some simple exercises to recognize and build a mind-muscle connection to be able to control the spine and control the muscles of the spine. So we're talking planks, side planks, bird dogs and bridges. Those will start to build in place the muscular stiffness that's required to create that stability. Because again, if you go back to what I was talking about before, is if it's stiffness in the spine, the stiffness could be there because of instability. So as we start creating stability, the muscles start to relax naturally. if we've got hyperflexibility within the spine, we need that control anyway, so we need to create a degree of stiffness to again bring us back into the sort of the optimal range rather than the extremes at either end. So we need to be able to start with those simple exercises, build the mind muscle connection to the core muscles and to the sort of spinal muscles, to then be able to move on to the next level, which is then starting to integrate movement and the spine. So hip rotation, hip flexion, hip extension, shoulder rotation, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, but also upper back or thoracic spine rotation over lumbar spine rotation and lateral flexion and things like that. So again, we need to sort of segment the spine off to be able to say, right, this is my thoracic spine extending and not my lumbar spine extending. So we need to be able to pull all of this together and integrate all those parts of the anatomy within the exercise. So we start simple, and then once we've got the mind muscle connections with the plank, the side plank, the bird dog and the bridge, we can then start building in hip hinges, hip rotations, shoulder movements, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, and all these different types of movement. But if we try and go into big, large movements, as I again mentioned in episode number 1 when I talked about bandwidth, people can't recognize these big, extravagant movements and what muscles are happening. They're just literally trying to complete the movement of moving the arms or the weight from position A to position B. Whereas what we need them to be able to do is say, right, this is my hip, this is my spine, this is my shoulder. This is when it's working, this is how it's working, this is how much it's working. And all these different types of things, and that comes with understanding bandwidth. So when it comes to understanding spine flexibility as a sort of a summary or conclusion to all of this, spine flexibility is a good thing. It is a necessary thing, but it needs to be controlled. Spine stiffness doesn't mean that it's bad. It could just mean that there is an underlying instability in the system, which is why it's gone stiff and and created that stability through the stiffness. So we have to first of all understand what's going on there. So we have to understand the anatomy. Then we have to understand who the individual is, what they need their spine for. Is it just straight up lifting in a warehouse, which will require stiffness, or is it something more like a golf swing that would require some degree of spinal flexibility and control? So once we understand that, once we understand where the anatomy is, we can start to pull the two together. What we can then start to do is then start building in the spine stability that's required. But first of all, we need to get the mind-muscle connection, which will come along with that. Once we've got that spine stability, hip stability, shoulder stability, thoracic spine stability, once we've got all of that in place, we can then start building in movement and then start making sense of what we need to be able to do with regards to more sort of sophisticated exercises when we're talking about movement, and not just jumping into movement, because that could cause a problem in and of itself, because not only are we're jumping in at the deep end, doing too much movement, that overwhelms the brain, which just in some respects causes the problem even more. So we need to understand it in this logical way and build you back into movement, but understanding what movement the spine needs and what movement you want to complete everyday tasks or sports that you want to do in everyday life. Many thanks for watching episode 4, where we talked about spine flexibility. Hopefully you've gained from it, you've gained some knowledge, you've gained some greater understanding about how the spine works or how you want your spine to work, and then you're able to put in place the necessary exercises or movements that you need to be able to do that. If you do need any help, please do click the link below, go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain consultation, assessment and coaching, and then what we will do is go through and start putting a plan in place to help get you where you want to go with your back, with your lower back pain, and with your body as a whole.